The air on the 50th floor of Sterling Capital's Manhattan headquarters always felt thinner, charged with a silent, potent energy that wasn't entirely about ambition or success, but about tenure and inherited power. From the panoramic windows of the executive conference room, the late afternoon sun painted the skyscrapers of the city in hues of gold and rose, a breathtaking backdrop that felt utterly disconnected from the stifling atmosphere inside. I stood at the head of the room, a lone figure in a tailored navy suit that suddenly felt less like professional attire and more like a costume I hadn't quite grown into. Facing me were the dozen or so senior partners, the gatekeepers of Sterling Capital, their faces a collective portrait of seasoned finance veterans. Their suits were impeccable, their watches understatedly expensive, and their collective gaze, as it settled on me, carried a weight of skepticism I felt deep in my bones. At 32, I was a decade, sometimes 2 or 3, younger than anyone else. In that room, for the past 8 months, my life had been consumed by data, projections, and the quiet hum of my laptop late into the night. I had been meticulously building a case, identifying a blind spot in Sterling Capital's investment strategy, a massive burgeoning market that the firm, in its adherence to tradition, was completely ignoring. My proposal was for Green Horizon, a dedicated fund focused on sustainable infrastructure and renewable energy, a sector I believed was not only the future of investment but also critical for the planet. I clicked to my first slide, a clean, modern design contrasting sharply with the room's old-world elegance. "Good afternoon," I began, my voice steady, projecting confidence I didn't entirely feel. "I'm here today to present an opportunity that I believe is not just significant, but essential for the continued relevance and growth of Sterling Capital." I walked them through the slides, each one a testament to hundreds of hours of research. I showed them the exponential growth curves of the renewable energy sector, the increasing global investment in sustainable technologies, the shifting priorities of institutional investors and younger generations of wealth. I presented detailed financial models projecting robust returns, risk assessments that demonstrated diversification benefits, and a clear strategy for sourcing and managing assets within this new fund. I spoke about the declining yields in some of their traditional fossil fuel investments, the increasing regulatory pressures, and the reputational risks associated with ignoring climate change. I argued that Green Horizon wasn't just about doing good, it was about smart, forward-thinking finance. I was passionate, yes, but my arguments were grounded in hard data, in market analysis, in financial projections that stood up to scrutiny. I fielded their questions, some genuinely curious, others laced with thinly veiled doubt. I explained the complexities of power purchase agreements, the nuances of carbon credits, the long-term stability of renewable energy assets compared to volatile commodity markets. I felt I was making headway, chipping away at their ingrained skepticism with logic and evidence. Then, Robert Sterling spoke. As the managing partner, his word was law. He was a man who seemed carved from the same mahogany as his office furniture, solid, imposing, and rooted firmly in the past. He had inherited the firm from his father, who had inherited it from his father. Innovation was not in his DNA. Preservation was. He cleared his throat, a sound that commanded immediate attention. "Anya," he began, his voice slow, deliberate, and dripping with a paternalistic tone that set my teeth on edge. "Your presentation, it's very comprehensive, very detailed. You've clearly put in a tremendous amount of effort." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, building a sense of anticipation that I foolishly interpreted as positive. He took a slow sip of water from the crystal carafe on the table, his eyes scanning the faces of the other partners, a silent communion passing between them. However, he continued, turning his gaze back to me, his expression shifting from feigned appreciation to something colder, more dismissive. "This Green Horizon, this focus on windmills and solar panels and whatever else, It's simply not aligned with the core identity of Sterling Capital. We are a firm built on tangible assets, on proven traditional markets. We understand oil, gas, real estate, established industries. This feels speculative, like chasing fads. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. My carefully constructed composure began to feel fragile. He leaned back in his chair, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. It wasn't a smile of humor, but of superiority, of putting someone in their place. Frankly, Anya, he said, his voice louder now, ensuring everyone heard the pronouncement, while I appreciate your enthusiasm and your unique perspective, I don't believe you truly grasp the fundamental principles upon which this firm was built. Your ideas, while perhaps interesting in another context, are simply not suitable for Sterling Capital. You don't belong in this room, presenting concepts that are so far outside our established expertise and comfort zone. You don't belong. In this room, the words echoed in the sudden, stunned silence. They weren't just a rejection of my proposal. They were a rejection of me, a dismissal of my expertise, my vision, my very presence in that space. My face felt hot, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. The other partners looked away, some staring intently at their notepads, others finding sudden fascination with the ceiling tiles. No one met my eyes. No one spoke up. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to maintain eye contact with Robert. Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice tight with suppressed emotion, with all due respect, I believe the data clearly shows that the market is shifting and that adhering solely to traditional assets poses a greater long-term risk than embracing new opportunities. He waved a dismissive hand. We've been managing wealth successfully for over a century, Anya. We understand risk. We understand the market. This conversation is concluded. My chest ached with the effort of keeping my composure. I gathered my laptop, my notes, the clicker. The weight of them felt immense. Understood, I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for your time. I walked out of the room, the silence following me like a shadow. I passed the administrative staff, their faces a mixture of pity and awkwardness. I didn't stop at my desk. I went straight to the elevator, rode it down to the ground floor, and walked out of the building into the late afternoon sun. The city was still beautiful, but now it felt indifferent to my humiliation. I walked for a long time, the words "you don't belong in this room" replaying on a loop in my mind. The sting was intense, the feeling of being utterly dismissed by the very people I had hoped to impress and lead into the future. But as the initial shock and hurt began to subside, a different emotion started to surface, cold, hard, and resolute. Robert Sterling was right. I didn't belong in that room, not with that outdated, insular mindset. But that didn't mean my ideas were invalid. It meant I needed a different room, a different table, one I would build myself. That night, in the quiet of my small apartment overlooking the city, I didn't dwell on the rejection. I channeled the anger and humiliation into fuel. I opened my laptop and began working on my Green Horizon proposal again, but this time, it wasn't for Sterling Capital. It was for my company. I spent the next few days refining the business plan, identifying potential investors who specifically focused on sustainable and impact investing. I reached out to the network I had built during my research, entrepreneurs in renewable energy, fund managers at smaller, more agile firms, environmental consultants. I didn't tell them about the meeting at Sterling Capital. I simply told them I was starting a new venture focused on sustainable infrastructure investment and that I had a compelling fund concept. On Monday morning, I walked back into the Sterling Capital office, not to my desk, but to the HR department. I handed in my resignation letter. It was brief and professional, giving the standard 2 weeks' notice. I avoided the 50th floor. I didn't want another encounter with Robert Sterling. Leaving Sterling Capital was terrifying and exhilarating. I was walking away from a stable, high-paying job with a prestigious firm, stepping into the unknown with little more than my savings. a business plan, and an unshakable belief in my idea. But the feeling of freedom, of being able to pursue my vision without the constraints of outdated thinking, was intoxicating. I rented a small, windowless office space in a co-working building, a far cry from the 50th floor views. My first hires were two former colleagues from Sterling Capital, brilliant analysts who had also felt stifled by the firm's lack of innovation and shared my passion for sustainable investment. We named our company Ascend Capital. The early months were a relentless grind. We worked around the clock, fueled by cheap coffee and sheer determination. Fundraising was the biggest challenge. Pitching to investors, facing skepticism about our youth and our focus on a niche market, dealing with rejections that sometimes felt personal. There were moments of doubt, late nights staring at spreadsheets, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake. But we persevered. We refined our pitch, highlighted the market data, emphasized the rigorous analysis behind our strategy. We found investors who did understand the opportunity, who were looking for exactly the kind of forward-thinking approach we offered. Our first major breakthrough came when a large European pension fund, with a strong mandate for sustainable investments, agreed to anchor our Green Horizon Fund. Their commitment opened doors, attracting other investors who saw their participation as a validation of our strategy. With funding secured, Ascend Capital began to grow. We started building the Green Horizon portfolio, investing in tangible, high-impact projects: solar farms powering communities, wind turbines generating clean energy-efficient building retrofits. We focused on rigorous due diligence and active management, ensuring strong financial returns alongside measurable environmental benefits. Our fund performed exceptionally well, exceeding initial projections. The demand for sustainable investments was even greater than I had anticipated. Ascend Capital gained a reputation as a nimble, expert player in the green finance space. We hired more people, brilliant young professionals who were eager to work for a firm that valued innovation and purpose. Our small, windowless office was quickly replaced by a larger suite with plenty of natural light and collaborative spaces, a vibrant, energetic environment that felt miles away from the hushed corridors of Sterling Capital. As Ascend Capital thrived, news about Sterling Capital grew increasingly grim. The industry grapevine buzzed with rumors of their struggles. Their traditional portfolios were underperforming. They were slow to adapt to digital transformation. Key talent continued to leave. Robert Sterling's leadership was increasingly criticized, internally and externally, for its rigidity and lack of foresight. They were missing out on major market shifts, including the very sustainable investment opportunities I had presented. Then, the rumors turned into news. Sterling Capital was in financial distress. They had made some significant losses, faced client defections, and their revenue was in sharp decline. They were quietly exploring options, including a potential sale or merger, a lifeline to avoid collapse. An idea began to form in my mind, audacious and almost unbelievable. Ascend Capital was strong, profitable, and growing rapidly. Sterling Capital, despite its struggles, still had a valuable brand history, established though aging infrastructure, and a client base that, while shrinking, represented significant assets under management. Acquiring Sterling Capital would instantly catapult Ascend Capital to a new level, providing access to institutional relationships and a larger operational footprint, while allowing us to completely overhaul their outdated systems and integrate our successful strategies. It wasn't just a business decision. It was deeply personal. It was about taking the firm that had dismissed me, that had told me I didn't belong, and transforming it into something new, something that reflected my vision. I presented the idea to my lead investor and my executive team at Ascend. There was a moment of stunned silence, followed by a surge of excitement. They understood the strategic value, but they also understood the poetic justice of it. We decided to pursue it. The acquisition process was complex, fraught with challenges. Sterling Capital was resistant, particularly Robert Sterling and his old guard. They saw us, a younger, smaller firm, as an unwelcome intruder. But their position was weak, their firm bleeding assets and reputation. We had the capital, the strategic vision, and the determination. We navigated the due diligence, the negotiations, the legal battles. It was a hostile takeover in everything but name. Exactly 1 year and 3 months after Robert Sterling told me I didn't belong in his room, I walked back into the familiar, imposing lobby of the Sterling Capital building. This time, I wasn't an employee. I was the CEO of the company that had just acquired them. I rode the elevator up to the 50th floor. The view was the same spectacular panorama of the city, but the atmosphere inside the firm was different. It was tense, uncertain. Employees I passed looked at me with wide eyes, whispers following in my wake. I walked directly to the executive conference room. The door was closed, just as it had been that day. I took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling upon me, and pushed it open. Robert Sterling was seated at the head of the long table, surrounded by a few remaining senior partners. Their faces were etched with defeat, their usual air of confidence replaced by grim resignation. They looked up, startled, as I entered the room. I walked to the head of the table, not to the side chair I had occupied before, but to the very spot where I had stood to present Green Horizon. I placed my briefcase on the polished surface, the sound echoing in the silent room. Robert Sterling stared at me, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Anya," he said, his voice barely a whisper. What are you doing here?" I looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the men who had witnessed my humiliation, who had remained silent when I was dismissed. The silence was heavy, charged with history and the reversal of fortunes. "Robert," I said, my voice clear, steady, and carrying the full weight of my new authority. "I'm here because Ascend Capital is now the majority shareholder of Sterling Capital. As of this morning, the acquisition is complete. This firm belongs to Ascend now." I paused, letting the reality of the words sink in. Their expressions were a mixture of shock, disbelief, and dawning realization. Effective immediately, I continued, my gaze sweeping across their faces, there will be significant changes. A new leadership structure will be implemented. Outdated practices and personnel will be retired. We will be integrating Sterling Capital's operations into Ascend Capital's framework, focusing on innovation, agility, and sustainable growth. The era of relying solely on traditional assets and ignoring the future is over. I looked directly at Robert Sterling, the man who had tried to diminish me, to tell me I wasn't worthy. The condescending smile was gone, replaced by a look of utter, devastating defeat. "You once told me I didn't belong in this room," I said, my voice low but firm, each word deliberate. "You were right. I didn't belong in your room, with your limited, backward-looking vision. So I built my own. And now, my room has acquired yours." I picked up my phone and dialed a number. "Security," I said into the phone, my voice projecting calm authority. "This is Anya Sharma, the new CEO. Effective immediately, please change the access codes for the 50th floor and issue new access cards based on the list I provided to HR this morning. Anyone not on that list will require immediate escort from the premises." I hung up and looked back at the stunned, silent men around the table. "This room," I said, gesturing around the space, the spectacular view now a backdrop to a corporate revolution, now belongs to Ascend Capital. And we're going to transform it. We're going to build something extraordinary here, something that looks to the future, not the past." I didn't linger. I didn't need to. The looks on their faces, the silent acknowledgement of their defeat, was enough. I had taken their dismissal, their contempt, and turned it into the fuel to build something stronger, more relevant, something that had ultimately come back to claim the very space from which I had been banished. Walking out of the conference room, down the hallway that now felt like the path to my future, I felt a profound sense of vindication, but also a deep sense of responsibility. The challenge ahead was immense, integrating two companies, changing a deeply ingrained culture, proving that a firm built on vision and innovation could successfully absorb one built on legacy and tradition. But as I walked, I knew I was exactly where I belonged, not just in this building on this floor, but at the helm of a company poised to lead. Robert Sterling had tried to define my place. A year later, I had redefined his, and taken his room in the process. The view from the top was even better when you had built the tower yourself.